Good morning. We were looking at computation, and in that we looked at a few ways in which we can access thread IDs and block IDs. And then we were looking at some of the historical aspects related to how graphics processors, then GPUs, then GPGPUs progressed. And in that, one of the questions that comes up, just as a more like a background information which you should be knowing, is who are the GPU vendors? Right? So, any suggestions on who are the GPU vendors you know of?
NVIDIA, Intel,
Okay, Shivabrata says,
AMD.
yeah, sure. So AMD, NVIDIA, AMD. Rigved is saying ITEL. Okay, Intel. Oh, I see. Okay, okay. Good. So these are the typical ones that we know of. Thankfully, this year I got this answer of Intel, but so far I have not gone beyond. I have not received anything beyond NVIDIA and AMD. Right. And the reason is that these are the vendors that we usually know of. But it turns out that there are large number of vendors in this space, and it's just that they do not manufacture the GPUs that we use for the usual computing related aspects. Sometimes these graphics processors or accelerators, they might not even be called GPUs. These are many times on chip. That is, these are integrated GPUs along with the CPU, and these are used primarily for the gaming and the graphics purposes. And all these companies have their own some sort of accelerators for graphics and so on. Some other things that you should be aware is that there are different kinds of GPU languages. I mean, CUDA is definitely one, which is called as Compute Unified Device Language. But we should know that it is NVIDIA specific. What that means is that it's proprietary. Only NVIDIA has control over CUDA. Right? So whatever are the design features of that language, those are decided completely by NVIDIA. If there is support information, that will be coming from that specific company. In contrast, there are languages. So yeah, in contrast, there are languages such as OpenCL, called as Open Computing Language, which is supposed to be universal, um, of course, open source, and it's supposed to work across all computing devices. Whereas CUDA, it works across NVIDIA devices, but there may not be support for other GPUs that might exist. Whereas OpenCL, because of its open nature, you can get it supported on your language, on your device. Think about it more from the very similar to Microsoft Windows versus Linux. Right? So this difference is quite similar in that aspect. Then there are other frameworks or other languages like OpenSCC, which are again open source and supposed to be universal, which work across all accelerators. OpenCL is not about accelerators. OpenCL is about all devices, which means that even on your CPU, you should be able to execute the same OpenCL program. Right? So what we have to do is on CPUs, we write some program in C or Fortran or C++, Java, etc. And then we convert that program into CUDA to be able to run on the GPU. Whereas if you have written an OpenCL program, it's expected that it will run on the CPU also, GPU also, maybe some other accelerator also if there is support. So that turns out to be very productive from the perspective of the programmer. A similar thing is about OpenACC, where there are different accelerators, as we saw, FPGAs and GPUs, etc. So OpenACC allows you to have that code written once and execute it on different accelerators. It might not work on the CPU because CPU is not called as an accelerator, but otherwise it should run. At the same time, OpenACC actually can run on the CPU because you actually start from a CPU code and then add pragmas to it, very similar to OpenMP. And therefore, OpenACC code can technically work on the CPU, although it will not be executing in parallel. So these are some of the terms that you might come across when you are dealing with, when you are reading through GPU related material, etc. So what are accelerators? Accelerators are more like many core architectures.
Sir, sorry to interrupt, but your slides are not visible.
Oh, the slides are not yet visible. Oh,
They were visible, but past one
okay.
minute is not.
Oh, I see. Sure. Thanks a lot. I'll just share those again. Okay. So since I was on the slides, I was not able to see the discussion here. Okay. Now is it visible? Can somebody confirm?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Thanks. So accelerators are many core architecture, which means that you have probably hundreds or thousands of cores associated with it, and they typically perform a very nicely parallel operation on the. Typically, the same operation is being done by all the accelerators. In contrast, the CPUs, which are called multi-core, these are not specifically designed for this. All people doing exactly the same operation, kind of. So they are called as let's say multiple instruction, multiple data kind of programs or devices, the CPUs, which means that each core is executing, each thread which is running on each core is executing arbitrary instruction, and there need not be any as such coordination amongst them unless the programmer demands. In contrast, the accelerators typically have more like a marching army, right? So they are always in sync. Although there are large number of them, they all need to be in sync with each other. So think about the accelerators in that aspect. All right. Any other questions so far? Okay. We'll move ahead. Apart from these languages and frameworks, there are also libraries and APIs which are supported.
Sir, your
As you can see that, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
your presentation stopped again.
Oh, what's happening? Is it that when I'm switching to the presentation, it's a little strange. Okay, maybe when I'm moving to the next slide, so let me try to press enter now. And is it stopped again? Okay, thankfully.
No, it's fine. It's fine.
Okay. I don't know what is happening. Okay, we'll see. But please feel free to interrupt me if it gets stopped again. Okay, so these libraries and interfaces are more like high-level, let's say, functions which are provided to you in your own language. So you might be aware of, let's say, Python or JavaScript, etc., and you are not interested in learning a new language like CUDA. In such cases, it makes sense to provide certain APIs in Python itself or in JavaScript itself, such that you will be able to execute your parallel codes directly onto the accelerator. So that is specified by these interfaces. So for example, there is PyCUDA, PyCL, etc., which are different interfaces or libraries which are supported. The advantage of that is that, again, there is improved programmer productivity. But at the same time, there is also a possibility that you might not be able to get as good performance as you would get otherwise from coding in a very low level language such as CUDA. So otherwise this interface needs to be very carefully designed such that it allows not only the higher level aspects, but also that it allows you to extract out the lowest bit of performance when you are trying to write your program in a high level language such as Python or JavaScript. The another advantage of this is that you can start with a sequential code which is already there, which is the case in many applications. That is, the code is already written in Python or JavaScript, and then slowly you modify the most time-consuming parts using these libraries. At the lower level, for example, LLVM, which is the low-level IR, the intermediate representation of several high-level languages. For example, C, C++ can get lowered into an intermediate representation called LLVM. Or even for GCC, the intermediate representation is called GIMPL. From this lower level intermediate representation, you can convert that representation into a CUDA assembly. CUDA assembly is called as parallel thread execution, or PTX, which is very similar to our usual LLVM or GIMPL IR, but it has those parallel related constructs. And that PTX assembly, using an assembler, you can convert into an executable. So that also is a very attractive option, because LLVM is a common IR for many languages. For example, you can write Fortran code, C code, C++ code. There are other interfaces from even Python, etc., which can be converted into LLVM. And all of this is kind of unknown to you. It is happening directly in the background. At the higher level, you have only your favorite computing language. So these are very interesting libraries. As part of this course, we are interested in CUDA, but these interfaces do exist. And having underlying knowledge of GPU programming does help you in making these the use of these libraries more effective. So in case in your projects you require to use these libraries, maybe initially you should definitely go for it. If you are getting enough performance that you expect, you don't need to worry about writing the complicated code in CUDA. Why not use OpenCL instead of CUDA? That is a good question. It's actually sometimes more like a political question. The reason being that CUDA is proprietary, and this OpenCL is open. And by the way, OpenCL is supported by a consortium of many important players in this domain, including NVIDIA, AMD, Intel, etc. So all of these people support OpenCL, which means that OpenCL can also run on NVIDIA devices. So why not use that? There are a couple of aspects. One is, at least in my opinion, NVIDIA has made CUDA really quite good in terms of performance when it runs on GPU devices. And some people have tried to perform performance comparison of the same code written in OpenCL and CUDA. In some aspects, OpenCL turns out to be reasonably close to CUDA, but in some other aspects, since the primary vendor of GPUs is NVIDIA and CUDA is tightly associated with it, they are able to perform things much faster. Right? So there are always, for example, if there is Google Chrome, which you are using for Google Meet, you will find that there are additional functionalities supported by them. Right? So it's in a similar manner. The second aspect that has happened is that NVIDIA came up with CUDA much earlier than when OpenCL was designed, and therefore it looks like, although there are very good similarities between the two, since OpenCL is supposed to be working across all computing devices, it has its limitations. So it has to have a common minimum, which is not the case for CUDA. So CUDA can come up with freely come up with additional constructs which can take advantage of the architectural features. So that definitely is an advantage of CUDA as of now. It's possible that things will change, but I have been listening that OpenCL will change the world, and everything that is currently CUDA based will be replaced by OpenCL. That I have been hearing since I was a postdoc. It has not happened in the last 10 years. Maybe it will happen sometime, I don't know. This race in some sense is very similar to what we have with respect to Windows versus Linux. I mean, when Linux came up, everybody or many people said that Windows will be replaced by Linux. Linux is open source, free, etc. That has not happened, right? So there are people who will be using this Windows as well as Linux. So I think it leads to whatever is your personal choice and comfort. Any other questions here? All right, so we'll move ahead. I'm going to show you certain configurations in two GPUs. So there are different kinds of GPUs which are coming from NVIDIA. let's call it different generations of the GPUs, right? So like we have Linux versions coming up, right? So similarly, there are different kinds of GPUs. And some of the features that one can think about in these are how many SMs exist. SMs meaning the streaming multiprocessor. Um, so a slightly previous generation, which is currently being used also, is called as Pascal family of processors, or P100 is a specific GPU within that family. Similarly, Volta GPU is another GPU in that family. So the number of multiprocessors in that, right? Each multiprocessor will have certain number of cores, right? So there are 56 multiprocessors versus 80 multiprocessors in the Volta GPU. The total number of CUDA cores is 3584 in P100, which means the number of multiprocessors is 3584 divided by 56. And similarly, 5120 divided by 80 for the Volta. As you can see, the number of cores that are available on a single device, this GPU is a single device, is quite large. Now, don't think that this GPU is going to be present on your laptop. This GPU is going to be quite big, almost like, let's say, maybe 20 to 25 centimeter versus around 10 centimeter in length and breadth, with probably 2 or 3 centimeters in depth. So this is going to be a large GPU, server-end GPU, which is definitely not present in your laptop or mobile. There are little different smaller end GPUs which are present in our laptops and mobiles. So these get housed in one of the typically the servers, especially our Aqua cluster on the in the institute will have all these Volta GPUs installed on them. And definitely there is no comparison as such. I mean, your CPU is going to have probably 40 cores or so, whereas the number of CUDA cores is much larger. But that doesn't mean that you will get that much performance benefit when you compare these two. Right? And we'll learn more as we go along. Volta GPU is also capable of performing certain tensor operations, the matrix related operations, into the hardware, right, which was not possible in the earlier Pascal GPUs, for example. The amount of performance that you can get out of a single GPU, it has increased from, so a single GPU is capable of giving you 5 teraflop performance. Right? So that is really awesome. And that is only increasing with Volta and now Ampere GPUs. One of the things that is required on the GPU is that since GPU is running with very large number of threads, each thread needs to have enough local memory available with them. Right? So this local memory many times is mapped into global memory, that is whatever is there on the stack. But there is also a set of registers which are available, like we have on the CPU also. And the number of these registers is very large on the GPU. For example, the register file size is around 14 MB on Pascal and around 20 MB on the Volta GPU. What that means is that across all the streaming multiprocessors, you have 20 megabyte of data you can store across all threads into the register file. And if it's more than that, then it gets spilled into the caches as well as the main memory. But because of this, a large amount of data is actually very close to the CPU, very close to the processor, and not CPU, the GPU processor, and therefore you are able to get a good performance. So if you have very small amount of data in your threads, a lot of it is going to be available into the register. So that's an advantage. Compute capability is an aspect which tells you what all functionalities are supported by this particular device, which means that, and these are all backward compatible, or I mean, the newer GPU will have, you can execute, let's say on Volta, you can say that I want to compile my code with compute capability 6, and then the newer features in Volta will not be available, and so on. So this is for backwards compatibility that this compute capability is given. It also specifies what all features are supported, right, by that particular device. So for example, if you are running some tensor code, you will have to compile your program with appropriate CUDA compute capability. Right? Or if you are using dynamic parallelism, you cannot run it before, for example, before 3 compute capability and so on. Then the memory is currently a little low on the GPUs. So 16 MB and 32 MB onto GPUs compared to how much memory will you have on your CPUs? Typical sizes?
8 GB to 16 GB.
On your laptops, okay.
RAM,
Right.
RAM or
Yeah, RAM, I'm talking about. Okay. So on your laptops, you have around similar memory. On server ends, maybe some of you have probably access to the Aqua cluster. How much memory is there on the Aqua cluster? On one node, on one machine? Or typical sizes of server end memories?
32 to 64.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so some of the slightly better servers will have 32, 64 GB, even 128 as Jayatish is saying. On Aqua cluster, each node has 192 GB of memory, 192 GB of RAM available per node. And that's quite large for some of our computations. And it turns out to be very useful for the users when they want to increase their data size and want to run those faster. So compared to that, it's very small compared to what you have on the CPU. And that's one of the current limitations of GPUs. But considering that GPUs are used as accelerators, where most of the part is going to be in the CPU memory, and then you offload whatever is the required computation to the GPU, get the results back, process on the CPU again. Further, some other part you push to the GPU and so on. So for that, this turns out to be okay so far. But yeah, there is more that is definitely required. There is one question which is there by Rigved, that is 20 MB for each SMX? No, it's across all the across the whole of the GPU. That means across all the SMXs. There is a few KB of memory, a few KB of registers which is available for each SM. So SM was the term which was used in the earlier generation. SMX is the one that is going on since Kepler family of processors. Any other questions so far? Okay, so these are all not really technical things, but I feel that as students of parallel programming, GPU programming, you should be aware of a few things. Shall we go ahead?
So what is that 100, V100, V100? So 100 is what?
100 is for the, I mean, that is more like a version of,
Okay.
Pascal is a family of GPUs, and within that there are multiple GPUs. For example, I don't know of other Pascal processors, but for example, in Kepler, we had K40 and K80, right? I don't know where that number comes from. It's something internal. It has nothing to do with the number of SMXs which are present in that. It's probably something which is more internal or more as a marketing thing, right? So at least I'm not aware of 100 has any resemblance with any of the hardware features. Okay, so okay, so yeah, go ahead.
Sir, how are SM streaming multiprocess different from CUDA and GPUs? Like, are there separate units present in the GPU?
Are you asking how the streaming multiprocessor are different from the cores on the GPU, or?
Yes.
Okay.
Like,
yeah. So
that's all.
yeah. So GPU is constituted of multiple streaming multiprocessors, right? So in this case, for example, 5120 divided by 80, how much is that? Let's say 64 or so, right? So there are 64 multiprocessors present in this GPU. Okay? Within each multiprocessor, and as soon as you say the multiprocessor, that means that there are multiple cores onto the same multiprocessor, right? And each multiprocessor in this case is going to have, sorry, I said something wrong. There are 80 SMX, so there are 80 multiprocessors, and each one has 64 cores. available within them, and therefore the total number of CUDA cores turns out to be that. So each multi-processor, that is each SM, is capable of running multiple warps or one or more warps. In this case, since there are 64 cores in one multiprocessor, it can run 2 warps at the same time. Right? And then multiple warps can keep executing in time multiplexed manner. So the hierarchy goes like, I'm going to show that hierarchy. There is GPU, below that is the streaming multiprocessor, below that is the core.
Okay, sir. I think so. You didn't taught about warp, so you'll.
Yeah, I didn't. Yeah, I am going to show that what the streaming multiprocessor is. Sure, I'll show you. Okay, so we'll move ahead. And one of the other things that all the students in high performance computing should know of is this top500.org. Some of you might already know it. So it's actually a listing of the most powerful machines in terms of performance in the world, right? So there is this race of or wish of going towards the exascale computing, and all this listing of different machines tells us where we are, right, in the world in terms of the number of floating point operations per second that can be performed onto your machines. So I want to tell you, I want to ask you, does anybody know where the most powerful machine in the world exists? So this listing comes up every 6 months, November and May. So recently in November, 3 months ago, we had a new listing. China, good. Japan, okay. Fugaku, Japan, okay. Yeah, so it was China a year ago, and it has recently been updated to Japan, America. So all these countries that you are talking about are actually the ones in the first 5, Japan, China, and America. And I'm going to show you those. So yeah, as Arihant said, Fugaku is the top one currently. It has over 7.6 million cores, which means that you can actually run so many threads at the same time. Of course, this is a very big cluster, which is a distributed system, and a lot of them will have GPUs and so on. Right? So that is rank 1 from Japan. The second one is from USA, which is Summit, which was also the top supercomputer some time ago. The third one is again from USA, which is called Sierra. So these are all typically at the national labs, LLNL or ORNL in US, which perform very heavy duty processing onto the clusters. The fourth one, which was Taihu Lite, is the one which was earlier, or the version of Taihu Lite was the topmost some time back, which has been superseded, and this race continues every 6 months. So things will change again. The fifth one is also from the US, right? So a few questions for you is, what is India's rank here? And where is this computer and how many cores does it have? In case you know, you can push it directly to the chat box. Chennai 36. Okay. Okay. Any other suggestions? Okay, so last year there was the topmost computer from India was actually at IITM, but IITM is not our IITM. IITM is Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology, which is there in Pune, which is now at second position. Yeah. So the top one, it has recently been changed to a supercomputer at CDAC. Right? So that is the recent one. Okay, so I'll leave it for you. You can look through that listing and figure out. So India's supercomputers, I mean, we are definitely not in this race, right? We are very low in this list. But our race is not for performance. Our race is primarily towards I mean, our supercomputers and the amount of money that we have, I think that gets used more for the atmospheric studies, ocean related, wind related, monsoon related, which are very important for the Indian subcontinent. So our studies primarily make use of these supercomputers for these purposes, rather than being in this particular race. Yeah. So the machines from CDAC are in the family of Param. Right? Param is, I think, super, is what I understand. So the supercomputer family is named after Param. Okay, so good discussion on this one. Let's come back to the technical aspects. So let's perform a matrix multiplication, and just to keep things simple, we are going to keep both the matrices the same, and therefore it turns out to be a matrix squaring. So what I'm going to do is to take a matrix which has certain size. I'm going to first let's say code it up on CPU, let's say in C or C++. I'm going to time it now. So we are slowly getting into the timing of all these codes, because performance is a primary aspect. I mean, the whole notion of parallelism comes because we want to execute the codes faster. So therefore we need to know how to time all these things, etc. So I'm going to do matrix squaring, and a typical matrix multiplication turns out to be a triply nested loop like this, right? So I'm going to write this on the CPU. So I have a matrix, and just to make sure that CPU GPU comparison is almost the same, I'm keeping the matrix representation also the same on both the sides. So since we saw that a matrix, that is the double dimension array, needs to be represented using single dimension, I'm going to represent the same onto the CPU also, just to make sure that things are almost the same. The code is going to remain the same, right? So there is a matrix which is the input matrix, then there is a result which is going to be a single pointer but representing n cross n result, and then the matrix size, which I'm going to initialize to 64. Right? This is again very small for our purpose, in general, but for our purpose it suffices. So I go over I from 0 to matrix size, j from 0 to matrix size, k from 0 to matrix size, and then the result of ij plus equal to matrix of ik into matrix of kj, right? So that is the usual terms that we used inside the matrix multiplication. So let's say that this code works out and it gives the correct answer. For n equal to 64, when I timed it on my machine, on my laptop, on a machine which has an associated GPU. So I got CPU time to be 1.527 milliseconds for n equal to 64. Now, whenever I talk about this CPU time, what is this time coming from? I mean, what is the time that I should be measuring? Okay, let me ask you in this manner. What is the time?
The time that this process was taking up on the CPU.
Right. Yes. Okay. So there are some answers which are coming up. Time for square CPU function call, wall time, compile time plus execution time, starting of function call to function completion. Sure. So all of these are different ways in which you will measure the time. And depending upon what you want to do, your time might, what you want to measure will differ. For example, if you are interested in the overall end-to-end time from writing the program all the way towards final answer, then your compile time as well as the execution time will come into picture. However, typically people say that compilation is once, whereas execution is multiple times. So compilation time kind of gets amortized over multiple executions, and therefore compile time we can possibly ignore in most of the applications. So then if you ignore compile time, I can say that, okay, there is a time command onto Linux. So time a.out is what I'll do, and whatever time it gives, maybe the wall time, that is going to give me that is the wall clock time. That is going to give me the actual time of performing all of this computation. Then some people will say, oh, but see, you are going to create the matrix. And how will you create the matrix? Maybe you will create it using some random values, or you will load the matrix from a file. And this is going to be common across CPU as well as the GPU program. So why do you want to take into consideration that? That is one aspect. The second aspect is that, again, the loading of the matrix might happen once, but you might actually use that matrix more and more times throughout the program. So I don't want to measure that matrix loading time. So all of these are different considerations. All of these are valid considerations. You need to know depending upon what your application demands. So then some people say that, oh, no, I can't have all the time that is required for loading not only the matrix, but also a.out binary gets loaded into the memory, right, from the disk. So there is disk access involved, which is probably going to be in microseconds, whereas my code is probably running in, let's say, nanoseconds or even picoseconds sometimes. So that is definitely something which is going to be a bottleneck, the disk access time. So I don't want a.out loading time to be added. So all of these are different considerations, and therefore many people, as Jaitesh is suggesting, they go for timing only the square CPU function call. But as soon as you go for square CPU function call on CPU, this makes sense. But then you will be noting down only the time for the kernel execution. But there is also time required for transferring the matrix from CPU to GPU and getting back the result from GPU to CPU. So do you want to measure that time or no? If you want to have fair comparison between CPU and GPU, maybe that time should be measured. Right? But if you want to just find out how much is the performance difference with respect to the execution of matrix multiplication or matrix squaring, then maybe I'm not interested in the GPU CPU transfer time. I'm only interested in the execution time. So all of these need to be understood, and you should be aware. And time was an easy command for us to be run on the command line. But then if you want to measure something within a function, within a program, then I need to modify the program. Right? So I will have to insert some function calls to measure appropriate places where I can time. Right? So get time of day or clock. These are a few functions which typically people use in the CPU code to measure time. Yeah, so that is one way in which we should be able to measure time. What I have done in this case is measured only the kernel execution time. Right? That means that in this case, yeah, so in this case, I measured only the kernel execution time, which means only the function execution time, and then for the GPU, only the kernel execution time. All right. So that turned out to be 1.5 milliseconds. The second aspect that is important here is that this time is very small. Right? This time, 1.5 milliseconds, is actually very small. And it's possible that if I run this code again, maybe I'll get 1.3 milliseconds or maybe 2 milliseconds. This time is so small that it can fluctuate quite a bit. So which time should I take? Should I take the minimum? Should I take the maximum? Should I take the average? Which time do you think will be more appropriate? Average, you mean average time, average, run for some number of iterations and average. Okay, so all of you seem to be agreeing on some sort of average. So the average of many runs, okay, median. Okay, median is another interesting aspect. So if the variation in the execution times is not large, then average turns out to be, the arithmetic average turns out to be reasonable. Geomean typically gets used for the pure quantities like speed up, whereas for the absolute quantities like execution time, we usually use arithmetic mean. Median might turn out to be an interesting thing because there might be exceptions in your execution time, and those get sorted out if you take median, right? So that exception should not suddenly increase the average, right? So or decrease the average. So these as Karthik Suresh is mentioning, median also turns out to be a very useful entity. So depending upon how the distribution of the data is, you might be wanting to use arithmetic mean or median, sometimes mode, or even the geometric mean when you have slightly different quantities such as speedups. It gets used. Okay, so in this case, I have done that. I have taken the average of different runs. I should definitely not take the minimum or the maximum, right? So maximum is something which is quite pessimistic, but minimum is definitely very optimistic. But you are not guaranteed to get that unless your requirement is such that I want to know what is the minimum amount of time in which this code has run, right, on this particular hardware also. Okay, so this is good. So we have this 1.5 milliseconds as an average. What we are going to do is to now convert it into a CUDA code. So I want you to think about how you will convert this code into CUDA and at least write some sort of pseudocode either online or in your copies. So I'll wait for a few seconds. So one thing that we usually do whenever we convert a code from CPU to GPU is to look for loops. And we actually have nice 3 loops here. So which loop would you be like to parallelize on the GPU? That is what you have to think about. I, J, or K, or multiple of them. Okay, some suggestions are coming. Outer 2 loops, I loop, parallelize over loop variables I and J, I loop. Okay, good. So yes, we would like to parallelize on okay, outer 2 loops I and J. Okay, so maybe I will ask you right away. Why should I go for, first of all, an outer loop and not the inner loop?
You have to add values to the same entry in the inner loop, and you'll have to provide parallel access to memory, right?
Right. So what Chet is suggesting is that the innermost loop, the K loop, has to access the same entries, right? So if you parallelize based on K, you will get some issues. The reason being that this changes for the value of K. This access changes with the value of K. But as far as this result of I, J is concerned, that is not changing with K. And what that means is that for multiple values of K, you are writing to the same memory location. Right? Depending upon the fixed values of I and J, for multiple values of K, you are writing to the same memory location. And that will require you synchronization. So it probably makes sense not to touch the K loop with respect to parallelization. Now, as far as I and J are concerned, let me ask you, why did you choose I? Why not J? And why did you choose both of them? So somebody can answer that. See, as far as the amount of parallelism is concerned, that is the same in both of them, right? So I loop is going to give you matrix size amount of parallelism. J loop is also going to give you matrix size amount of parallelism. So why would you choose one over the other? Okay, so there is really
access for cache. So if I choose the I loop, I'm accessing the element sequentially. So at a point, you'll bring a chunk of memory. So
very good. Row major access is what Chagnik has also saying. Sai Venkat, both are the same unless there is space caching. Good. So all of you seem to be, at least some of you seem to be understanding the reason why going for I might turn out to be more beneficial than going for J. And the reason is with respect to the way we are accessing memory. We are accessing the memory row wise, which means that for a particular value of I, I'm going to go over all values of J, right? Because J is inside I. So fixed I, let's say I equal to 5, and for that I'm going to go from 0 to matrix size -1. And that means I'm accessing different elements of that particular row. That is what we do in the matrix multiplication. Here, when I'm accessing result and when I'm accessing the first matrix. When I'm accessing the second part of the matrix, then my access is column measure. But since two accesses are row measure, I'm going to get more benefit out of I. I will also get some benefit out of J, but it will be smaller, and therefore I would prefer to go with I. If this would have not been the case, then it doesn't matter which way you do. Right? And we'll learn a little bit about this row measure versus column measure when we deal with memory, which is the next part of the slides. Okay, so Aditya is asking, can we repeat why we couldn't parallelize the KK loop? See, for KK loop, what's happening is that if you fix the value of I to be, let's say, 5 and J to be, let's say, 10, then I'm going to go over, I'm going to write to different values of in this result array, result matrix, for the same values of ij, which means that it is the fixed location, right? So 5 into matrix size plus 10 is a fixed location of result, to which I am adding multiple elements of k. So if I parallelize KK loop, then multiple threads, that is multiple iterations of this third loop, are going to write to the same memory location result of 5 into matrix size plus 10. And therefore they will require some sort of synchronization. Recall our do not feed the cat example. Right? So multiple threads are writing. So that means there is a data race in this, which means that we might require some additional protection if you want to parallelize this, which will take away some of the benefits of parallelizing. Okay. So, okay, parallelizing I turns out to be better. And then some of you have now said that maybe we should parallelize both I and J. So can somebody tell me why?
The more the merrier.
Okay, good. Yeah, so in this case, since we are assuming n to be 64, matrix size to be 64, it turns out to be reasonable that you can parallelize in both ends, and there is enough parallelism. There is nothing dependent on J or I. While we had, there was some dependence, some data race which was coming because of K. So it turns out that you will be able to parallelize both of them. Let's go step by step. First, we'll parallelize I and let's see what we get. So I'm going to parallelize it with I, right? So that is my version 1. And therefore my kernel is going to be 1, n, where only I loop is parallelized, and therefore the I loop will go away. The kernel is going to have the J loop and the K loop, right? Similar to this. I'm ignoring the CPU part that I think we'll be able to manage with whatever we know. So there will be a CUDA malloc required for matrix, CUDA malloc for result. Then there is CUDA memcopy for matrix. No CUDA memcopy for result as of now. After the square matrix is done, then I can do a CUDA memcopy from device to host for result. So as you can see, the I loop is gone. That is the parallelism that we have for the square. Multiple threads are executing different iterations of I that is based on my ID. Right? And then I'm going to have all of this accessed here. So that ID essentially gets used where I was using I. Right? So here as well as here. So this turns out to be very nice. At least I have gotten some parallelism out of this. And what does the performance benefit say? The performance benefit says that this GPU version runs slower, 4 times slower than the CPU version, right? So this is a little setback for me. Why is this running slower than the CPU version? Any suggestion? I mean, I have parallelized it, right? So by all means, it should run at least as fast as the CPU version. Overhead, don't make up for the parallelism, okay. Less value of matrix size, okay. Loops run slower on GPU, n is too small for any benefit. So all of these are possibly going to be valid suggestions. CUDA memcopy, I think I did not measure CUDA memcopy time. I'll have to check. I think we have the codes available, but yeah, I'll have to check. Okay, so where is the overhead? Vignesh is asking, where is the overhead? The overhead is in terms of the kernel launch. So there is, sometimes we also call the copying as the overhead. And then the kernel getting launched is also one overhead that we need to worry about. Thankfully, over generations, this kernel overhead has reduced considerably. It's quite small, a few milliseconds for that matter, right? But in this case, it is going to matter because the timing of this is very small. So it's possible that for this value of n, we are getting very small, we are not getting any benefit, but there is another reason. The another reason is that, okay, so as Jaitesh is saying, the frequency of GPU cores is low compared to the CPU clock, right? So that what is the typical value of CPU clock that you have possibly on your laptop? Okay, 3.5 to 324, 2.5, right? So all of these are reasonable frequencies that you have on your laptop, right? What is the GPU clock frequency? Anybody knows? GPU 1.4, 1.5, 1.2. On these, on these integrated GPUs, these are going to be slightly higher like this. Whereas on the server ends, where you have more number of cores, more number of streaming multiprocessors, the GPU frequency might turn out to be 1/3 of your CPU frequency. So it could be as small as 0.7 gigahertz or 745 megahertz and so on. So not necessarily because of the heating problem, Shovik. I mean, there are multiple factors here. One of the factors is related to energy, but you cannot go beyond a certain limit when you have large number of cores, because the data is not really available at that speed for you. So that is one reason. Okay, I think we have exceeded the time. So what we'll do is we'll look at the second version, which is going to be I and J loop together in our next class, and let's see how much performance benefit or degradation we get. Okay, so we'll stop here unless there are any quick questions.